Good evening and welcome, as I think David Frost used to say. I'm Edward Bickham, one of the trustees, and for my sins, the curator of the exhibition, which I hope you've had a chance to look at, and if you haven't, there's a chance to look after the session today. Welcome to Arundel's, and apart from managing the house and the collection of art and sailing and political memorabilia, we also try and have a useful and interesting programme of events, some of which are artistic and take place in this garden, some of which are musical and take place in our drawing room, and some of which are speaker meetings that explore important issues that would have been of interest to Edward Heath, such as climate change, such as the future of farming and ethics, all of which we've had meetings about this year. And we also have a series of events and exhibitions that look at the second half of the 20th century, i.e. Edward Heath's period as an active politician, and in order to think about the lessons to be learned from those issues. And when judged by that criteria, a focus on the Ugandan Asian crisis of 1972 was an obvious candidate. Because it's a key opportunity to reflect on our treatment of those in need and on the nature of political leadership. One statistic that struck me in researching the exhibition is that when the government took its decision, only 6% of public opinion supported it. That is unusual courage, and was an example of Britain living up to its obligations. And it's a very compelling topic. There's no shortage of human interest, of personal tragedy, and of people struggling and succeeding against adversity. So there's stuff about how the Asian community came to be in East Africa, around the events within Uganda, the events back here in terms of how people were received, how people were mobilised in a remarkable period. And one of our attendees today, Alan Critchley's father, was indeed the secretary of the resettlement board who pulled off this remarkable logistical challenge. And looking at the political struggles for acceptance, and then the way in which the community succeeded, sometimes against some really difficult odds, and have been a huge asset to Britain. So a few thank yous. First of all, to the Aliawalia Foundation and the Rumi Foundation for their support for the exhibition. To the Volcanoes Safaris for their sponsorship of tonight's event. Thanks to the many people whose advice has helped me to build a picture of the events. The speakers for coming to make their contribution tonight. To Jess Kay, our event manager, Emma Golby-Kirk, who's been helping us with some of the outreach to improve our inclusion and diversity, to Shobna Phillips and Manoj Patel, who've lent items, to Lord Guardia for his kind advice and lending us some important things from the 25th anniversary, Kate Walter, our curator, and our army of brilliant volunteers who've been showing you around the house. So with those thanks behind me, may I now hand the baton to Praveen Moman, who is the founder of Volcanoes Safaris, who propitiously are celebrating their 25th birthday this year, and former government special advisor, colleague of mine, and who will guide the discussion now. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Edward, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you most of all for that fantastic exhibition. We have been discussing this for months. If we could give Edward a hand for this. And there were moments when I thought it would never happen. Edward seemed to be always researching the next image, the next quote, the next somebody or other, the next whatever. And I said, do you know, it's now 3 months to go, now it's 2 months to go, and now the exhibition is next week. So what Edward has pulled off is fantastic. Isn't England an amazing country? I've had the privilege tonight to meet the 761st Mayor of Salisbury. Now, there are not many other countries in the world where you randomly rock up somewhere, as they say in modern English, and meet a mayor who's been around so long, so to speak. And they're only allowed 1 year in office, presumably because if they stay longer, they'll steal everything. This is continuity, and this is the history of Britain, isn't it? Which varies so much from many of us in this room connected to other parts of the world. That famous English phrase, have you come far? Some of us have come a very long way, it seems, and are continuing our journey. This is a very special evening at Edward Heath's house, as you know, because of what we're about to discuss. And let me just canter through 1,000 years of East African history in a few minutes, just giving you the highlights, and then my colleagues, who I'll introduce in a second, this distinguished panel, will take us through their different views. And we're very, very lucky to have people who are so closely connected with this story. On the 4th of August 1972, President Idi Amin of Uganda, a former warrant officer in the British King's African Rifles, announced that the British Asians were to be expelled in 90 days. Even though they held British passports, there was inevitably controversy about this. The Sunday Telegraph held President Amin responsible and blamed black racialism. Nothing much has changed there, I think. The New York Times blamed the Indians and Pakistani migrants, as they called them, for not integrating enough. The Times of India was concerned about the repatriation of assets. President of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, called the expulsion terrible, horrible, abominable, and shameful. Amin's government said Kaunda is an imperialist agent and a black sheep among African leaders, which was quite a riposte, I think. Elspeth Huxley, the famous writer from Kenya, from a settler family, had one short sentence. She said, the trouble with Ugandan Asians is success. The Kenyans sealed their border to prevent Ugandan Asians going to Kenya. They still wouldn't let me in 1982. Thank you, those of you who are connected to Kenya, such nice people. My father, who was, how does one describe him? I have to be careful. My sisters are here, my brother-in-law and my son, and my wife. My father was a man in his own planet. So unperturbed by this announcement, on the 4th of August, on the 5th of August, he set off on his last safari to see the tree-climbing lions in western Uganda. My mother's reaction is not recorded. So Prime Minister Edward Heath, faced with all these different responses, his response was very clear. He said, this is our duty. There can be no evacuation of this. These are British subjects with British passports. They are being expelled from their country, which in many cases is the land of their birth. They are entitled to come here and they will be welcome here. So let us acknowledge Edward Heath right at the beginning. His leadership changed the fate of Ugandan Asians. It could have turned out very differently, but for him and his government, and David Hunt, of course, will talk about the experience of the inside story of the Conservative Party at the time. And my father, who was a colonial officer for many years in the British system, and then a resettlement officer for the Asians in the London borough of Haringey, he said in his writings, which we're going to be publishing shortly, that British policy for Ugandan Asians was ambiguous and contradictory. Edward Heath's bold assertion of British responsibility to its subjects caused by the Amin expulsion helped solve the issue. So why did we have Indians in East Africa? Why did we have them in Uganda? Well, of course, the Indian Ocean is connected, to Africa and India, and the Indians dominated trade in the Zanzibari Sultanate in the 19th century, to the extent that Sir Richard Burton kindly referred to them as the local Jews, possibly not in a very positive way. But after 1884, as you know, the management of the world changed, so to speak, in Africa, as the Berlin Conference gave the European powers the control over Africa. And we saw dramatic political change, which we're not going to discuss today. But in 1896, some 35,000 Indian craftsmen, surveyors, and laborers were brought by Britain to build the infamous Uganda Railway. Some 2,600 died, just as a matter of course. And in Victoria's Tin Dragon, a book written by Satya Sood, who happens to be a cousin, a railway child, he describes the Indian endeavor, and he also comments on how handy a Sikh turban can be when you're in these circumstances, both for protection against the sun, the sweat, mosquitoes, and it can be used as a rope, a bandage, and a water filter. So I commend the Sikh turban to all of you. With the railway, of course, came the white missionary, the settler, and the administrator. And then the Indian administrator and the fearless Dukawala. The Dukan in Hindustani is a shop, and the Dukawalas of East Africa are legendary for what they did. I think Napoleon's description of British shopkeepers pales in comparison. And amongst these, the charming Ali Din Avizram became the leading merchant from Nairobi to Uganda. And this would be a whole discussion in itself, because he was the richest man in East Africa by the time he died in Uganda in 1916. Curiously enough, Churchill, of course, went everywhere and talked about many things, as you know, in his life. And sometimes it's hard to agree with him, for some of us. But in the case of East Africa, in 1907, he summed up the situation really well in a piece that the Guardian might have called Race and Class in the Empire. You wouldn't normally expect Churchill to be associated with that. But this is what he documents. He said, the Colonists Association says, we aim to make East Africa a white man's country. He then notes the Indian was here long before the first official, and he constructed the railway, and the Sikh soldier pacified all these areas. And the Indian trader has penetrated where no white man would go, and the Asian's industry and business aptitudes is what gives him economic superiority. These are very strong words, isn't it, if you think about it in 1907. Then they get even stronger. So he said, it's not against the black man that the prejudices and interests of the white settler or trader are arrayed. It is the brown man who is the rival of the European. So as Churchill also noted in this, race was the big thing in East Africa. And he also said it was everywhere in the world, and East Africa showed it. So his complex relation showed what life was like, that things worked, the empire was opening, there was prosperity, there was an economy, but there was a division. Colonial life, schooling, job promotion, housing, hotels, clubs, land ownership was segregated. The Indians occupied the middle and the lower layers of society, except for the wealthy few. The Africans were largely at the lower end. As Yasmin says in her book, color-coded class divisions between whites, blacks, and browns became ever more embedded and unyielding. Ugandan Asians kept their heads down, built up more acquisitive middle-class lives. These differences, of course, then come to haunt us in the post-independence years. But perversely, and this is something that I think is written less about, during the colonial period, the Indians were not only economic rivals, and sometimes not always treated well by their European masters, but they worked in partnership as administrators and kept the sinews of empire together more than in any other part of the empire. You did not have the Indian administrator in this number anywhere else as you had in East Africa. And for example, by the 1950s, there were possibly about 500 British civil servants in East Africa and about 7,500 Indians in the civil services. In my own extended family, in 1927, my great-uncle, Charanji Lal Fakke, from the village of Katani Kala, near Ludhiana in Punjab, pitched a tent some 20 miles from the source of the great river Nile in Uganda, where it was not uncommon for a leopard to skulk. From this tent, Fakke became His Majesty King George's postmaster, King George V's postmaster at Iganga, not far from where some of our panel has grown up. And he was only the third of my father's great uncles to work in the colonial service, and then my father joined later. And there were many hundreds from the Punjab who worked as postmasters, station masters, and telegraphists, the vital link with the outside world. So then let's move to the 50s and 60s in this final part of this look at what life was like. We had about 80,000 Ugandans, it is said, who lived in Uganda. Some were British subjects, some were Indian citizens, some Pakistanis, some stateless by then. And it seemed that the sun would never set on the African empire. I went to a school called European Primary School, very helpfully, with a handful of Indian pupils, but no black African children. I learned to sing rather badly, Onward Christian Soldiers, which has helped me a lot in life. And in 1962, Uganda became independent from the UK relatively smoothly. But the next 10 years, and that's what our panel will really look at, until the expulsion in 1972 was turbulent. Newly elected Prime Minister Milton Obote and President Freddie Mutesa struggled for power, and Mutesa went into exile in England, where he'd been to school. President Obote gradually established a one-party state and began to reveal a darker side to his personality. A number of prominent figures were imprisoned, and under the Common Man's Charter, 60% of major industries were nationalized, as the Tide of Fortune, which Giles co-authored, records. So suddenly you have a white administration till 1962 doing what it feels is right, and then you have a black-led government who are, of course, not very keen on the past, more socialist and want to change the world. So the status of Asians in that, their nationality, their identity, in the newly identified country, now run by black African politicians, changed overnight. There was increasing pressure on Asians to have African partners in business, licenses were restricted, and demands made that they become citizens. Many families started leaving or sending their children abroad for studies. And this, of course, is often criticized by many people, and possibly justifiably. But of course, the black governments had to also, quite rightly, look after the majority of their citizens and provide for them in their own way. Unfortunately, things didn't go well, and by 1971, as you know, Idi Amin, the army commander, took power in a coup, and in 1972, he expelled the Asians. He started the reign of terror against the African population, who suffered much more than the Asians, and Uganda fell apart. And these are the notes from my father's exit when he left Uganda. On the 26th of October 1972, in his exercise book, he said, "The ring is closing in. 25 springs have passed in Uganda. I have held part of this country. On this last night, I think of the ground I have trodden, far off places and the hidden valleys, remote rivulets and tracks. I will always think of this country with extreme affection, and my heart will always be here. I would like to go back to East Africa, our country. We have lost a paradise which will not be regained." So I hope that sets the scene in different ways. Maybe you won't agree with all of it. Maybe I've said some terrible things. But then it's a very, there are many sides to this story. Let me now finally turn to our illustrious panel. Nimisha is the High Commissioner for the Republic of Uganda. So that is another twist to this story, that for the first time, it's not for the first time, it's the second time that we have an Indian High Commissioner in London, an Indian origin, Indian for the Ugandan government in London. She was actually born as part of the Madhvani family, who are a well-known family in Uganda, as you will know, on the family estate in Kakira, 10 miles from Jinja, where Ravi was born. A long-term Ugandan diplomat and one of the few of Indian origin. She was at school in England at the time of the expulsion. Then we have, of course, David Hunt, who many of you will know. He's been involved with Edward Heath and Edward Heath's house for many years. He was at a very crucial position in 1972. He was chairman of the Young Conservatives and mobilized the huge membership that it had in changing the policy of the Conservative Party. And he's going to talk about that. And of course, this affected his political career, but he will come to that in a minute. Yasmin Ali Brown, many of you will know, she's a commentator and has very strong views on many subjects. She wants to be controversial, she said. So we said, well, we'll have to discuss that. She was born in Uganda in an Ismaili family, and she's the author of the Settlers Cookbook, which you may have read, which has some wonderful settlers' family recipes and mixed in with her life's journey. And she was at Oxford at the time of the expulsion. Giles Foden, again well-known journalist and author, long connections with Africa and partly grew up in Uganda. And he wrote The Last King of Scotland, which, as you know, is an intriguing novel based on Amin, also became a film. And he's co-author of a book called The Tide of Fortune with Manubai Madhvani, one of the main industrialists of Uganda. And last but not least, Councillor Ravi Govindia. Ravi has been leader of Wandsworth Council until May this year. I don't know where the Conservative activists were, but they threw him out. One of the longest serving and respected Tory leaders in Britain. And he was born in Jinja, and he is basically, in my opinion, tried to make Wandsworth like this small Heimat or beautiful town of Jinja, which he will bore us about, I'm sure, later on. But in between, though he's doing these things, he's been responsible for the redevelopment of the Nine Elms area, and which includes the American Embassy and the Battersea Power Station. And he will tell us about life in Dartmoor. So let me start, which is where he first arrived when he left Jinja. It's a pity he was let out. So maybe we can start with Nimisha. Nimisha. So if you can't make fun of your friends, what else can you do? So all three of the Ugandan Indians on stage, Ravi, Yasmin and Nimisha, grew up in Uganda and had parallel lives, similar sort of ages, but obviously different circumstances. So let's start with Nimisha. Nimisha, what did your family do in Uganda and what was it like growing up there?
First of all, thank you everybody for being here to hear a new Uganda and learn really the past, and Praveen and all of you for welcoming us so warmly and the history. Thank you. And the mayor of London, of Salisbury and the deputy. Thank you. Well, all I can say is Uganda. I'm born in Uganda, I'm bred in Uganda. I got kicked out of Uganda as a little girl. I was at school over here, and I've gone back to Uganda, and I worked for the government, which is just so, it's so significant, it's so symbolic, and it's just such an honor. My family is in industry. My family, I'm very proud. I have a wonderful family. Sadly, my father died in 1971, but he contributed to the economy with my uncle Manubai, who Giles has written about, and was ironically, as the history that Praveen referred to, was made chairman of the Export-Import Corporation in 1970, when Obote was going into the whole spirit of socialism. And then to come back to Uganda, when whatever they all built, and what our family built, from sugar to textiles to light bulbs to glass to just a whole cross-section of multiple conglomerate industries, to see the entire country, not just our own business, in ruin, and to see little children who used to have smiles on their faces had fear in their eyes, and that was just so sad. I was also still very little, so 1979, 1980 when we went back. So that's basically what my family. So our hearts were there, always wanted to be there. We're back, and we're very honoured that the President Museveni and the government have, welcomed the Asians back and given back the properties on his principles. It's the right to have your properties. It's yours. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nimisha. Yasmin, what was life like for you in Uganda as a child?
We couldn't have lived in more different lives. You couldn't possibly imagine how different. One of the things I was saying earlier, there are so many gaps and holes and things we need to be thinking about. There's always this assumption that East African nations or Ugandan nations were rich. And we were privileged, even those of us who were poor were still much less poor than the Africans. But I lived actually on what was Alidina Visram Street above the marketplace. It's no longer called that, it's called something else. In a one-bedroom apartment, there were three of us, 3 children, and my parents, who had a terrible marriage, and my father would disappear for years. So my mother had to work 3 jobs to look after us, and I didn't even have my own bed till I was 12 years old. So I think that's one dimension that needs to be thought about, that we weren't all, from the kind of capitalist sector, if you like. I'm also a socialist. I've been a socialist all my life. And I think I started when I was 5. I remember going down to the marketplace, which the staircase would lead down to the marketplace. And I wasn't allowed to play with black children, but I would, because I was a rebel. And I would always come back and say, why don't they have shoes? Why do I have shoes? So this whole thing started very young for me. And like all, families, they couldn't understand why I was so upset all the time. So that's point number one. Point number two, so what do I remember? It was an extraordinary, beautiful place. The food there has tastes like food never tastes anywhere else. And, you know, we had incredibly privileged lives. Kampala in the evening, and this is in my book, which I will wave at you because it's just been republished, was not an African city. It was an Indian city. All the Africans disappeared back to their villages. We owned that town. Again, we need to be thinking about that. You know, Indian music was blaring, the cinema was full of Indian films. It was ours. And one of the resentments, I think, that built up was about the fact that we kind of captured the capital in a way without thinking about it, that our only relationship was with black people was of master and servant. But of course there were other kinds of, we had somebody who helped my mother cook for families, which she had to do, who called himself Japan, because he loved an Indian song, film song called Mera Jutta Hai Japani. People here will know that song. My shoes are made in Japan, my hat is made in Russia, but my heart is Indian. That's basic. And Japani loved that song. So he changed his name to Japan. And he was so close to us. So I'm not saying all relationships were, but it was unequal. What else do I remember? So I went to university there. To escape from a very difficult family situation. There were 2 scholarships, only 2 scholarships that you got, one for science, one for art. And I got the arts one, and somebody called Kiran Fadke, who became a heart surgeon, got the other one. So I went to university, and for the first time, I went in 1968, we were able to be friends with black people as equals. We'd never had this experience. There were some kids that come into our school, but it was only at university that we discovered this friendships and equality and common interests. I shall never forget dancing the kirikiri, which was the African dance, in the Makerere dance hall with other Africans. This is a new experience. And my biggest regret is this, that had Amin not come into power, a different future might have been created which would have been equal and multiracial, because my generation felt so easy about race differences. It couldn't happen. I also wanted to say that I do want the British government at some point, and the Americans and Israel, to actually give us some words on how they should not have backed Idi Amin. I know it was the Cold War, and I know Obote was drifting very rapidly towards the Soviet Union. But hundreds of thousands of black people died because this man was put in power. And we have not, there's a book you must read by Adam Curtis, which has the official papers where, you know, people in the High Commission are saying, we know he's a bad guy, we know he's killing people, but he's our man. I think we need some words to come out now, after 50 years, to say that was a mistake. And my final 2 points are these, that in all of this, the celebrations, I think we Asians need also to make a much clearer statement that we did not treat black people as equals. I was Juliet in a school play where Romeo was black. And when my family discovered this, not only was I beaten up, I won a prize to come and study drama here, which they didn't let me do. But because of that, my father did not speak to me till the day he died. And we have not addressed this enough. So those are the big points I wanted to make. I've been back 3 times. And what's wonderful is how much Ugandan Africans are still so gentle and welcoming. But there are three things I think that also need to happen. We haven't written our stories. I mean, I'm really pleased. I knew Manupai very well. The occasional book. But we've avoided our very rich story, the whole story of building the railway. The only woman who ever did this was an Italian woman in Kenya called Cynthia Salvatore, who wrote 3 books on those original people who came in dhows. And I really would encourage you to find those books and read them. So we were being too afraid of the written word. We need to tell those stories for our younger generation, which is why I wrote my book. And we need to tell a more honest story than we have told. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. It's a very interesting point.
Show the book to everyone so they know.
It is a rather wonderful book. It was Book of the Week on Radio 4.
Thank you. And talking about books, there's Bend in the River by V.S. Naipaul, which has some
Yes.
perspective. There are the books by Vasanji, and especially one called The In-Between World of Vikram Lal, about being Indian in this complex mixture of white and black. And also there's the book that's more complex, but it's called Brown Man, Black Country, written about the struggle of equal rights by Indians in Kenya. So there are some books out there, but not enough. As Yasmin says, I don't know, Indians build railways, they don't write about them. Although my cousin Satya Sood did write the Victoria's Tin Dragon, and there is the Lunatic Express, which is the original book, as you know.
And the Lions of Savo.
The Lions of Savo by Patterson, of course. Ravi, tell us about the Lions of Jinja.
Well, it's almost kind of bibliography of East African writing. I grew up in a town, it's quite a small town. You could walk from one end to the other on the shores of the Nile and Lake Victoria, surrounded by water, and so when I came to Wandsworth, the water of the Thames was very much a synergy there. But it was a town that was layered, in a sense that the best locations along the river and the lake on the higher promontory was reserved for the colonial servants. The manager of the bank of Barclays Bank had his house overlooking the lake. The Indian bazaar was in the middle of the town, and the African township close to the fishing port of Masese, around Lukuba. So the town was structured like that. You could walk from one end to the other, but you couldn't necessarily live in each of its 3 bits. You had to be of one type to live wherever. And in fact, if you visited the European townships in the middle of the afternoon, the chances are that you would get chased, because you were then seen as an unwelcome visitor. And yet in the evening, we would walk through it, drive through it, and sit by the sunset point overlooking the lake and eat our peanuts and mogu chips. I mean, that was the kind of lifestyle that lots of Asians had. And as both Praveen and Yasmin have alluded to, Jinja was quintessentially an Indian town. If you go even now, a lot of the town is built of Indian-style buildings. And in fact, they are all the more beautiful for it. But they also contributed to its vitality in the town and on its outskirts. Virtually every industry was Asian-owned. It had started from scratch, and it became part of that town. The fact that the Owen Falls Dam generated electricity nearby meant that perhaps the electricity for the industry was cheaper, which made Jinja the place to locate things. But it also was a place where earlier the cotton industry had found its home. Busoga Cotton and the Busoga Railway Company had made Jinja the head port for export of cotton from the whole of Busoga, from there to onto the railway line, which is where both Nivisha's family started life as cotton traders, ginners, and exporters, and the rest followed. But my father worked in the Ministry of Works, he was a carpenter, he worked in 2 jobs to make ends meet. We were a large family, we lived in a small house. But all of that kind of being not so rich, didn't seem to matter. We were an absolutely happy family in a very happy community. We looked after each other, we played with each other. In fact, a lot of the community, within a very divided Asian community, both in terms of caste and religion and so on, none of those mattered. In your neighborhood, you played as one. You were as one, and you went out as one. Lots of rules and rituals respected and honored, and we lived out of each other's homes. Every difficulty was supported by somebody who could help you out. So poverty, whilst there may be, was supported by the wider community in which we lived. And that was the warmth of the community which got shattered in '72. And that shattering of that warmth and togetherness is what older Asians still talk about with deep, deep regret, a huge sadness that such and such friend, Mary Ben praying Fala is nowhere here, I can't speak to her, she's not around. So my friend, my neighbor, she's nowhere around, I can't speak to her. We used to sit there together, do all sorts of things together. So this was a very happy, very satisfied community, rich, poor, middle class and a lot. And all of them investing huge effort into educating their children. They sacrificed a lot to make sure that their children were as well educated as they could be, because they saw education as the ladder. And that is the virtue which they have brought with them to this country, which is instilled in every Asian household. Do well and you will do well for your future. So that was my childhood, and that's how we grew. The regrets of the time Yasmin mentions, I mean, I was young enough that in my primary school to have one or two black pupils. Because urban schools were Asian dominated, because the urban setting was Asian. If you went to school, primary school in Balakuba, it would be African dominated. But I had friends, both at primary and secondary school, but there were not that many. But the first time I went back to Uganda, the saddest thing was to go back to my secondary school and speak to the head teacher, who showed me the yearbook of my last year at school. And every African name in that was either dead or they no longer lived in Uganda. The ravages of the Amin era had wiped out an incredibly clever and able group of people, either because they stayed at home and they got killed, or they had to flee and they were no longer contributing to it. So we must remember that the tragedy of us was a bigger tragedy for the people of Uganda who stayed behind.
Thank you, Ravi. It is important to remember that most of us came out with our lives. Yes, there was some harassment. We lost our properties. We lost the way we lived and everything, but we came out. Whereas possibly 300,000 Africans were killed.
500,000.
500,000. And the country really went into civil war for so long, and you could argue it's taken a very long time for it to get somewhere. You know, and since President Museveni took control, it had been so destroyed. Building a conflict country again is so difficult, as I know, working there for the last 25 years. But I want to also ask Ravi about what happened then. So 72, that's his life in Jinja. And as you know, everybody's pointed out, it's a curious paradox that in the middle of Africa, there are these Indian towns. Because yes, there was the colonial white power that ruled these countries, but generally the population of white people, say in Uganda, was 20 or 30% of what there were of Indians. So there were the senior quarters where the colonial structures and those people associated with lived. But every town, if you drove through it, especially in the 60s, and the music blaring out, a Sunday promenade, you felt as if you were kind of on, a would-be Bombay. So that was very special and very unusual and complex, as Yasmin has pointed out, that on a Sunday, if you were African, you would feel very odd that the whole town was taken over by these people who were brown. But Ravi then left Uganda, and what happened to you next?
Well, I left Uganda on the 13th of October. We landed at Stansted. We had a couple of days in Sussex, and we were then taken on by train to Plymouth, and by coach from Plymouth to a place called Plasterdown in the middle of Dartmoor. We arrived in a late evening of an October evening. It was cold, it was wet, it was dark. And whilst I had known wilderness in Uganda, this was very different type of wilderness. But the welcome was warm. I mean, I always sort of look back and say I was well supported in the school where I went to, local school, by both the teachers and the school authorities and the fellow pupils. My A-level curriculum completely changed, but they made sure that I had extra tuition, extra coaching to make sure that I got my necessary A-levels for me to carry on to go to university. Within a couple of weeks, my father had a job, so he was a carpenter joiner over there. He became a carpenter joiner at Veletort Joinery in Devonport. They got a home, upper 2 floors of a Victorian townhouse. The lower 2 floors were occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, and we made home there. It was a 2-bedroom flat, and there were 7 of us to start with, and then my older brother got a job in London, and he moved out to London. But that was the kind of early introduction to, and I'd say people have asked me whether I experienced dislike, hatred, racism, and so on. I am so fortunate. I am genuinely so fortunate that in rural Devon or in urban Plymouth, I did not. Now, maybe I kept out of everyone's way, but this is a naval town. Friday evenings were pretty rough, and Devonport, where we lived, could get rough. And yet we didn't really have that problem, and perhaps it was the internationality of a naval town.
What about food and spices? You were part of an extended family. What was their experience? This is something worthwhile before we move on.
We go back, we now go into Sainsbury's and find everything you need, irrespective of where you are. There was one shop called Continental Delicatessens in Plymouth, where you bought small sachets of Indian spices. I mean, the kind of sachets that my mother would tip out every day into one curry. I mean, it was not the easiest of ways. And the vegetables were, if it's winter, it's root crop vegetables, and if it's summer, it's a whole series of leaves and beans. Nothing exotic was available, and she despaired. And yet she did invent ways of cooking Brussels sprouts into an Indian curry. so there are, and baked beans are so easily made into a curry, because it's already got tomatoes in it, it's got a bit of onion flavour, and stick some chilies on it, and hey presto. So there was that sort of innovation. But there was despair. I mean, she never operated a Hoover, did not know how to do it. We had never lit a fire in our house. We knew how to light one. And that's where Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan are great allies, teaching us ways to do it. And they failed to do ones that light the fire properly, and the chimney caught fire. Because that bit of loose newspaper went up the flue, and the fire brigade had to come, and so on. So it was an interesting beginning.
Can I just tell one story it's reminded me of? I used to go into the camps to help the people if they needed to fill forms and so on. And it was they were near Oxford where I lived, and it was a pretty sad place. And one day I saw a group of men, Ugandan Asian men, round a tree, and they were really laughing their heads off. I said, "So why are you so happy today?" He said, "My dear, these people, they shut shop at 5. And they take weekends off. My dear, we're going to be rich."
Just a couple of last questions for the Ugandan side, then we move on to the wider side. What did you think one day you would end up as a refugee in the UK, or your families would? Do you think?
No. I mean, I was doing my A-levels. I thought I might do well enough to go to Makerere, which was well regarded. I thought if I got a degree, I would carry on doing something important, better than a carpenter would be. It was just, in fact, exactly what my father would say. And if you fail at school, you'll come to the workshop with me and help me in the workshop. That's your choice.
That was your incentive.
So no intention of coming here, and if I had come here, then it would have been as a tourist.
What do we think of the Ugandan Asian expulsion? Why do we think it happened? What do you think, as the three of you who grew up there? Was it coming? Was it Amin? Was it the British? Was it the Indians? What was it?
My own reflection, my maternal side of the family is for 4 generations were in Uganda.
Since about 1896.
Yes.
Yes.
And each of them I can go back and say they were more able to adapt to local. My grandmother spoke perfect Luganda when she was because she lived in a place where it was necessary to speak it. And she was perfectly happy to mix with the people she had to mix with. And as Yasmin says, we were obviously a generation with a wider outlook. And so, of course, if we had carried on, that would have made the change. So the pace of change perhaps was too slow.
Okay.
Our economic success was clearly a problem. And the fact we occupied a lot of the middle layers of both administration, the professions, and so on, made it very difficult to share the proceeds of independence equitably and easily.
Yasmin?
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think looking back, you know, it's a very difficult sentence, this one I'm about to utter. But Amin was cunning. He could smell people's views. He sensed how they felt emotionally. And so when he said, Asians are sending money out, it was true. As a threatened minority, my own family was sending money out. When he said we're not integrating, it was also true. It was beginning to happen, but at a very small, and he knew these were trigger words that would get to the population. And he used it, you know, to absolute advantage. I met him when I was in 1968 because there were student revolts going on in Europe and America, and Obote was very scared that students would do the same. So he ordered all the student leaders to go and live in State House in the barracks for 6 weeks. Amin was the general, and we were told, we'll take you to ministries, you can ask any question you like. Actually, we soon realized that they were looking for the troublemakers who began to disappear. But I met Idi Amin, this is absolutely true story, and I said to him, "Sir, why are there no Asians in the Ugandan army?" And he looked down at me and he started having that ugly laugh. And he said, "Because we don't eat choroko," that's dal, lentils. "We eat red blood meat. You are not Africans."
Do you have a comment, Nimisha? Why about the expulsion?
My thinking to some extent is similar. Amin's power base started to crumble. He took over, he had problems with the army, he was an army man, and he was an Obote supporter to wield himself into power, and he was involved in then the coup. And in March 72, before the expulsion, between around November 71, March, February, he started making anti-Semitic comments. And the American ambassador at that time very quietly picked all this up with their intelligence and had systematically about 300 to 400 Jewish residents who were working in Uganda at the time, leave the country without making a noise. And it was basically because Amin was then becoming very friendly with Gaddafi. So, the Arab, the Muslim, and he was himself a Muslim, and he was originally his ancestry is South Sudanese, so northern Uganda, where we house 1.4 million refugees in principle, because the president says we were all refugees, we must look after our people. So his power base was just crumbling, and the Israelis were training our army, and he was trained by them. So the rumblings of power struggle had commenced very early on in his regime. And then who is the next minority to target, who was controlling the economy to a larger extent, was the Asian community. And so, and as Yasmin has said, his popularity, he was able to get to the people by saying, okay, I've had a dream and I'm going to get rid of. I myself grew up with Ugandans. I mean, I had no difference. I went to school together, worked together, everything. It was just, because I lived in a sugar community, so we were together, everybody. And they were very sad to hear this. They didn't like this. And other people were in Kampala, rejoiced because of some of the reasons that have already been explained. So I think there was a lot of politics involved in this, and his wanting to hold on to power. Because even after throwing out the Asians, he was getting weaker. He had a fight with Gaddafi, who was giving him arms, and then that relationship soured, and that's why he eventually became friends with Saudi Arabia later on. And then he died there because he went there in exile. is thrown out. So this is how I think that some of that happened. So integration was an issue, but his power base was the biggest problem. And it was not just unique to Uganda. You know, there was problems in Ethiopia, there were problems in other parts of the region. So I think that's my small contribution.
Let's now switch to the man who caused all this problem, David Hunt. we were quietly minding our own business in Uganda. I think this is a great country. We're kind of surviving okay. The sun's shining, life's fine. And then the Brits were always sort of messing around with their nationality laws and confusing the whole world with what they wanted. And in 1972, as we said, Amin made the announcement. David was a young man at the time and chairman of the Young Conservatives. And suddenly he got involved in what was one of the main political fights of the day. So David, tell us about that. What led you to be the man of the hour? Why did you get involved in this pickle?
Well, taking Her Excellency's comment about integration, I have to just share with you all that I was brought up in Toxteth in Liverpool, where it didn't matter whether you were yellow, brown, black, white, whether you were Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, etc. We integrated, and I was rather proud of that. So I'm probably about the only person here who can talk about life in the bomb shelter when the bombs were falling on the Dingle in Liverpool and destroying all our homes. It didn't really matter. You were part of the same community. So then I was inspired by this young politician called Ted Heath, who came to speak to my university, and I was inspired by Ted. He represented the sort of society I wanted to see. A society where it didn't really matter about your background, you had equality of opportunity, a free society. And then a little later, the 20th of April 1968, someone I'd hitherto respected called Mr. Powell delivered a speech in Birmingham, which I have to tell you is the most appalling speech it's ever been my misfortune to have to read. And I've got the full transcript here, and it fashioned my attitude. And I was at the time vice chairman of the Young Conservative movement, and I dedicated myself to not only supporting Ted Heath in what was at the time a very brave act by him of sacking immediately Enoch Powell from his opposition frontbench post. But then when we approached 72, I became aware of what was happening with the Ugandan Asians. And having lived in a background where actually there were a lot of Hong Kong Chinese in Toxteth, as well as Asians, Africans, people from all over the world because of our status as a port, I became aware that Ted Heath needed support for his very brave act again of saying that the Ugandan Asians, because they had British passports, you don't snatch away a British passport just at the moment when they need that passport because they're in trouble. I decided I had to support Ted and Robert Carr and David Lane. And as chairman of the Young Conservatives, we had an emergency meeting to say that we very much supported the government in overcoming, as Ed Bickham reminded us all, only 6% of the population supported the move to admit the Ugandan Asians. I just took the view they had every right, if they had a British passport, to come to the UK. And we had an emergency meeting of all the Young Conservative leaders, and at the time we had over 100,000 members. It was a huge organisation. We had an emergency meeting and we said, we support the government and we want a motion at the party conference to welcome the Ugandan Asians. And we put forward this motion. The committee that decided on motions at the Conservative Party conference in 1972 decided not to choose our motion, but to choose a rather sort of hostile motion to be moved by the president of Hackney South and Shoreditch Conservative Association, who, in fact, the motion was to be moved by a Mr. Harvey Proctor. And we then heard, just before the conference started, that Harvey Proctor decided to hand over to the person who he admired most, Mr. Powell, and Enoch Powell was going to move this motion. And we had another emergency meeting of the Young Conservatives, and Jerry Wade was there, and we persuaded the organisers of the conference that we should be allowed to move an amendment to Enoch Powell's motion, deleting it all and inserting the words how much we welcomed the Ugandan Asians and how right the government was to make them feel at home in the UK. And we then came to the conference, and it was a pretty sort of turbulent conference. In fact, I think Jerry organised all the Young Conservatives who attended the conference to be up in the balcony holding placards, and when Enoch spoke, they had 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And when I spoke, moving the amendment was 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. It was a turbulent conference, but we won the vote and defeated Enoch at that party conference. And I remember at the time, the whole conference decided to support not only Ted Heath, not only Robert Carr, the Home Secretary, Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, the Foreign Secretary, and of course the Lord Chancellor Quintin Hogg, Lord Hailsham, because Enoch had attacked them all in a debate on Newsnight the night before, and we got the full transcript, where he called them traitors for allowing in the Ugandan Asian. So it became a turbulent debate, but that was my role, and I'm so proud to be on there. I still support. I'm so proud of our great Prime Minister, Ted Heath, in really taking on that issue, sacking Enoch, and then immediately at the time of the need of the Ugandan Asian, saying, please come. And I met the resettlement board, and I'm thrilled to meet the son of one of the key members of that board. They did a fantastic job, supported by a lot of young conservatives all over the country. They established centres which I never thought could be done in such a short time, where everyone arriving was welcomed.
No, it's a remarkable story, David. Thank you.
If I can just interject, first of all, to really thank the British government at the time, and we had Praful Patel, I think, who then was involved in the race relations to help them come in, and with you. And also, just to go back on the Amin side, is that as his power base was crumbling, he showed that he was in charge. So he put Sandy Gall of the BBC in jail, and he put my uncle Manuka Babai in jail. And to show that, like, if I can put a Madhvani in jail, well, I can do anything to any of you. And then, of course, then they were released, but it was a traumatic time for this. But at that time, Ugandans started disappearing. They would just vanish. If they were said anything against Amin, a Ugandan would just disappear. And I think Ravi and some other people have heard bullets, they've seen dead bodies being put into trucks. Ugandans just disappearing. So we really thank the British government and Sir Edward Heath. And then later, when my uncle came to London after his release and everything, he met with Sir Edward Heath and spent a lot of time, you know, seeing how this whole resettlement process. And Lord Jitesh's father was part of our family. We grew up as little kids together in Uganda, and you know, contributed so much to our family. So I think, and to the Ugandans, Asians here, and to Ugandans who are here, we have a community of about 100,000 Ugandan diaspora in the United Kingdom, all over, and they're very welcomed here. But as a result of what the British did, is why President Museveni strongly believes that people in the region who have problems, we have 1.4 million refugees from South Sudan, Rwanda, Burundi, wherever. If you
Second
have
biggest number of refugees in any country in the
yeah,
whole new
yes,
world.
yes.
That's
And
worth remembering.
the Turkey is
Think
the number
about
one.
Priti Patel. Sorry.
And well, Preeti is born in London, and she's actually from Ginger. Her
Yeah,
family.
but look. Sorry.
So my
But the thing I want to actually add to my gratitude is that, and I'm a lefty, the 68 Act that Labour passed was one of the most dishonourable acts ever passed. Even Oberon War said that in The Spectator, because it was a race-based entitlement law. So if you were a white Zimbabwean or Rhodesian, you could come freely with your passport, but we couldn't. So people forget.
Giles.
Exactly with Kenya. The Kenyan exodus was treated
Yeah.
totally different under Harold Wilson government to Edward Heath, whose hospitality we're sharing in his house today, was a total about thank you, Edward Heath.
No, it was a different and difficult story. Maybe we'll come back to that. Giles, you're an insider outsider in the Ugandan context. You lived there for a while, you've lived in other African countries, and then for some amazing reason you decided to write a book based on Idi Amin, Bull the Last King of Scotland, as we all know, which was also made into film, and then later on you worked with Manumai on his biography. What has this taught you about this odd community that we are and the difficult things we went through?
Well, the first thing to say is that I'm not part of it. I'm a semi-random white bloke who happened to live in Uganda for a while and happened to write
Well, you got connected.
some books. But and actually, the specific story of this amazing community that came to Britain is not really part of my most well-known novel, The Last King of Scotland. It's kind of there a lot in the film, but much less in the book, although there is one significant Ugandan Asian character. I mean, it felt like too big a thing to involve in that novel. It's a story in itself. I guess, I mean, when I wrote that book, when did I write it? God, it seems a long time ago, 96 or something like that, 97. The word cultural appropriation wasn't on everybody's lips then, but it might have felt like that. I mean, certainly Amin felt that I used to get that he'd been appropriated, although he did a lot of appropriation of his own. You know, I used to get messages from Saudi Arabia saying, I quite like the story, but I don't like the cover. And so I was like, which is a typical, if anyone knew about Amin, that's a typical thing he would say. But that's why I was so lucky later on in my life to have the opportunity of helping Mamisha's uncle, Manabai Madvani, write the story of his family, which began in the early 1900s, I think 1914, when his family emigrated to Uganda from India. And it's certainly true that they became perhaps they're still the most significant commercial enterprise in Uganda. But when this happened, they were riding around on bicycles through the jungle trading. It started from very, very small beginnings, and it's important to remember that. It's also important to remember what I think Yasmin has been stressing is that story of Ugandan Asian entrepreneurial success is not total. For example, I teach sometimes at the university, and I've had a student a couple of years ago whose grandparents were Ugandan Asian. They worked in the Dagenham car factory for Ford. They weren't part of the grand mythology of entrepreneurial success. That said, they worked. This is the real lesson I think that Ugandan Asians have for many of us in this country, is exactly what Ravi has been stressing: the primacy of work, the primacy of education, but also the primacy of a strongly linked community that supports each other. And you can still feel that. I felt it myself, being lucky to have been accepted into commanded by Mufwani's family, it's just getting involved and being helped by other people. It's really something special. So I'm grateful to have had my chance to be part of what Ugandan Asian support.
Thank you very much. We could keep asking the panel lots of questions, or I could, but possibly it's time for you to ask the questions now so that I can have a rest and you can get off your chest what you want to ask. We have a number of politicians in the country. We have people like my sister who was came as part of the expulsion. We possibly have some others. We have some East African hands. Questions, please. Sorry, Nimisha wants to say something. Yes.
I was little, and my father was in Riyadh on a sugar conference because we wanted to export our products, Ugandan products, to the United States and to UK. There was a sugar quota. So it was my family, the Mehta family, these were the two sugar families that were the people producing so much sugar. And the idea was to get Ugandan products out of Uganda to the market, which is actually what President Museveni is also trying to do today. Now, my father was in Riyadh at the sugar conference, my uncle Manubai was in Takira, and he came back immediately because, Amin called him. He said, I want to discuss the sugar. So my father said, okay, come back. And I nationalized these industries. And I was little, I was just used to picking it up. And of course, as you grow up, you start hearing more about the facts. But met Amin, my uncle, my Manubai Mehta, and in Kampala. And they came back, and with there was a dinner in Jinja. In those days, it only took like an hour to go from Kampala to Jinja, whereas now it takes like forever. But, because the road is so good. He came back, and we were having dinner at all the people who we referred to earlier in the cotton business, with the people in the lint marketing, and everybody who set up the cotton ginneries, the Vaderas, Ilujas, and there's a whole host of people that we should not forget, the Kotecha family, and so on. So he came back and he said, I met this guy, he's a madman. He'll put us into boats and throw us away. My father died just a few months after that. And a year later, he expelled the Asians. And it was just, you kind of think, what an uncanny comment. But of course, there's no way to know the facts of that because he's gone.
No, it was a strange period because he actually said when your father died, this is a true son of Uganda, look at his achievements. And a year later, he expelled the community. So it was quite odd.
So weird.
So please, questions from the audience and reflections or comments. Please say who you are and what your connection is, what you'd like to ask. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alex Gunter. I'm Alex Gunter. I'm a young conservative now, on the good side, of course. And my question to David is
We need you.
how did you win the support of the young conservatives at the time? Because you called these emergency meetings, but I'm sure that in these meetings you didn't have unanimous agreement. And if you did, that would be really interesting to hear about as well. So I wondered if you could sort of explain how you won that over.
Well, Alex, now, when you said you were a lefty, that's my reputation.
Welcome to the club.
When I was being selected as a Conservative candidate, there were quite a number of Conservatives.
He's a lefty.
He's a lefty. But I sense that there is an overwhelming support amongst the younger members of our society that they want to live in a multiracial society. There's too much prejudice. So what I sought to try and do with the Young Conservatives was to say, should we not be seeking the best possible society, one that integrates all the talents? So I found, with mainly thanks to Jerry Wade writing my speeches at the time, to secure the support. We argued passionately for a free, integrated society. And we were also aware of the talents of the Ugandan Asians, which would really raise the standard of living in the United Kingdom. But that wasn't the primary reason. The primary reason was to say, here are people who are being expelled, who, to some extent, we have a heritage of responsibility for where these individuals are. Having given them British passports, you don't snatch it away at a time. And I felt it was the idea of snatching away the passport in the way that Enoch was suggesting and accusing Sir Alec Douglas Hume in particular. He called him a traitor in the interview with Robin Day the night before the debate. That is what helped us consolidate the passionate support of the Young Conservatives for the arrival of the Ugandan Asians.
And now they are contributing to the economy here.
Hugely.
Interesting thing to me is that when this was happening at the Conservative Conference, I was at Devonport High School for Boys, and David was, of course, selected as a parliamentary candidate for Plymouth Drake, and suddenly it was no more. So he was also expelled.
I know.
He had his own expulsion.
There is that whole story actually, that how David was deselected from Plymouth Drake and then went on to win Plymouth.
Well, I had just been selected. I beat off, I think, 263 other would-be candidates. And I won the selection in Plymouth Drake. And then I went to the party conference. And then my adoption meeting just happened to be after the party conference. So the association had to agree to my adoption. And although I wasn't aware that there was a major multiracial society in Plymouth, they all really, only narrowly, but felt that attacking Enoch Powell was an undemocratic thing to do and an unconservative thing to do, and they expelled me. That night, when I got back home, filled with depression, I thought, it's all over, it's gone. The phone rang, and do you know who was on the other end of the phone?
Ted Heath.
Ted Heath. Yeah. Ted Heath had just heard the news that I'd been deselected by Plymouth Drake because of the attack on Enoch Powell at the party conference, and he filled me again with inspiration. I can just tell you, he told me, you have made the right stand. You must never feel you paid a price, because you shouldn't pay a price. I will do everything possible to make sure you become a Conservative MP. He shouldn't probably have made such an undemocratic commitment, but he did. And I have to tell you, that was a sign of the sort of person Ted Heath was. And it makes me proud to be able to say that here at Arundel.
Joe?
Yes,
There's a
Joe,
question at the back. Joe.
I was actually at the conference when you spoke. I think everyone in this room should know that David has not done remote justice to the sheer force of his speech on that occasion. And I think it made a huge difference, not just with younger people there, but I think it swayed a very large number of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s who actually realised what was at stake. And the other thing I would say is the remarkable skill with which David used Enoch's attack on Alec Douglas Hume, because some of you will remember that Alec Douglas Hume was, to all intents and purposes at that point, the party god, and that this would be rather like blaspheming in the middle of Mecca to attack Alec. And it was a remarkable, skillful thing. Can I add two other things? One of the most shameful things that took place at that time, as we referred to the 1968 Labour legislation, was the lack of support from the Labour Party for the government. I can recall a couple of weeks later, the no confidence debate in the Oxford Union, when somebody began by saying, I will not accuse Mr. Callaghan of suffering from racial prejudice. In point of fact, he enjoys it far too much. And that really went home because Labour, with that audience, because Labour had not supported the government and indeed had tried to exploit it. Last very quick point was in the Queen's speech debate following, yes, it was the Queen's speech debate following the decision. The Member of Parliament for Canterbury, a chap called David Crouch, who was a perfectly ordinary, standard, run-of-the-mill Conservative MP, made the point that he had gone round his constituency, knocking on doors, and he had been astonished of the number of people who said to him they'd heard what Ted Heath had said, they'd heard what Robert Carr had said, and they didn't like the idea of large immigration, but they believed the government had done the honourable and right thing. And I think it's very clear that it wasn't the people who were worried about immigration were still completely convinced, because of people like David and Ted Heath and Robert Carr, that there was the honour of this country was at stake, and that we had to behave decently. I shall make no comment on what is currently going on in certain parts of our
Thank you for
administration.
both comments, Joe. Thank you. That's great. There was a gentleman here. If you could bring the mic here, please, in the back. Yes, yes.
Thank you. The name is Peter Dawson. In 1972, I was a Conservative councillor, quite a young one, in Kensington and Chelsea. I can remember going to a reception centre being established in Kensington Church Street. I think it was either a fire brigade dormitory or maybe even an army centre, and I'm not even sure he was very greatly used. But I went there as a local councillor, as I felt that was the right thing. David, part of your ground troops. I then wrote to the local paper, totally endorsing your stance and Ted Heath's. Just as life moves on, when I then retired from a business career after many, many decades, I've had the delight and the privilege of being a Wandsworth councillor for 16 years and working closely with Ravi, which, just from the whole story, is a delightful privilege for me. So if you were called a lefty, you can imagine I just may have been on occasions, as Ravi will no doubt corroborate. Can I ask both David and maybe Ravi, what's happened to our party?
I think I hold that kind of question might come, and I think one of the problems is that our politics generally have become soundbite politics. Too much of decision making is entirely focused on what the opinion polls will say. What will happen in this local by-election or this local council election, and the issue that we govern for principles, we govern for outcomes that are in the national or wider national interest. All that seems to take second stage. Fighting elections to win elections to hold power for the purpose of holding power is a bit too not right for my. I mean, you and I worked in Wandsworth Council. We knew that there were challenges, but we had a purpose, and we needed to deliver our promises and actually deliver sometimes against our own instincts, but we had to do the right thing. And I think doing the right thing has become not necessarily the priority for government. That's the problem.
Thank you, Ravi. David?
Don't give up. There are huge numbers of us who believe that the future lies with attracting within the Conservative Party the vast majority of younger people who are in favour of conservative principles. They want freedom. They want not just freedom of speech, but they want freedom, enterprise, free markets. And although I recognise, and I've just had a great long chat to my good friend Frank Field about this,
Oh,
who's
right, yes.
slowly recovering, but is sadly terminally ill at the moment. We've just had a great long debate about how is politics going to attract back the younger generation. And I think London gives us a huge opportunity, because I'm proud every time I walk around London and I see perhaps 10, 15, 20, 25 different nationalities. And we all are inhabiting the same place on the planet. Surely a political party that can inspire principles again of a multiracial society will win votes. And I want that to be the Conservative Party.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
Can I just say one thing to follow up on that, which is, you know, that moment of idealism, that spirit of idealism that Ravi and David have talked about, that was nearly there with Namisha's father in Uganda. You know, there was a moment, if he hadn't died, where this might have happened there, that the possibility of that expulsion not having happened. It was quite useful to think counterfactually, what if it hadn't happened? And I know Ravi was going there with that. It could have been amazing. Could have been amazing.
Well, yes and no, actually. Because I think one of the amazing things about going back to Uganda, and actually I got to go to the beautiful house which I'd looked at, and we had the most wonderful time, thank you, Namisha, was that those Africans who never had a chance, because we didn't share our expertise, have become small businessmen and are doing very well. So sometimes you have to admit that, you know, the country actually changed for the better for those people. I know this is very not the right thing to say.
My mother on her last visit in 2006 said, "I'm so glad we were kicked out," she said. And I thought she'd gone mad, but she's absolutely right, like you are.
And in reverse, I think, you know, how some of the Ugandan Asians in Leicester have got a photo of Amin in their temples and say, "Oh, thank you for throwing us out." We would never have had this chance, you know. And now I'm trying to bring all of them back to Uganda, you know. And Lord Jita, she's going to host them all next Saturday on the 10th. And I'm going to have President Museveni, who's also going to come and appeal to you all to come and have a visit. So it's heaven on earth. Come and see it.
Yes, President Museveni is coming next week, as Nimisha says, to mark the 50th event. Thank you.
Giles and Lord Hunt, and everybody's welcome.
I'll never forget what he said in Neasden Temple.
Oh, yes.
He said, "Stop complaining." While you were in Shepherd's Bush, I was hiding
in Shepherd's
in the bush.
I was hiding in the bush and fighting.
No, whilst you were hiding in Shepherd's Bush, I was fighting in the bush.
It's a brilliant line.
Yes, sir. We have a question from the Deputy Mayor of Salisbury.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Atikul Hawk. I'm the local councillor and the Deputy Mayor. Well, as an Asian, it's very interesting to hear all the stories. But my question is, why does Idi Amin make that decision just to get the Asian out and not any other settlers?
Oh, you may have missed one point I had mentioned, that, you know, when he took over, his power base was beginning to crumble and have problems. So he made anti-Semitic comments. And the Israeli army was then training Uganda's army, under whom he was also trained. So the American ambassador quietly, so that community left Uganda quietly, who were controlling a lot of the economy and the training and the business and government money. And then things got worse. And then the next small minority was the Asian community. So you target, and in Uganda, whether you're Pakistani, Bangladeshi, whatever, we're all one. There was no difference. So that was the next target, but it still went on crumbling. He, you know, as soon as he realized himself that a soldier cannot run an industry. A soldier cannot be a medical doctor. A soldier, you know, you need that training. And then he became pro-Muslim, anti everything else. And then he had a fight with Gaddafi, fell out with Gaddafi. His next friend was Sadi. So it was slow minorities being targeted, small minorities.
Further answer, I mean, obviously there were a number of Ugandan ethnicities, Ugandan tribes that were basically attacked and exterminated, or there were attempts to exterminate them by Amin. So, you know, it wasn't just, as it were, foreign ethnicities that were attacked by him.
It's worth
That's what I mean
remembering
by
that there was
religion.
no large European settlement in Uganda because there just wasn't. So we were the settlers, and after us there was nobody.
Two more questions, and then unless there's more, we'll wind up if we may. Yes, sir. Question, microphone here, please, then the lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Danish Maini. My connection with Uganda, my granduncle was Sir Amar Maini, who was first.
Sir Amar Maini, who was the Chief Justice.
Wonderful family,
Yes.
excellent.
I wish I was the same.
Leading
But yeah, he was first Asian mayor of Uganda. So, Your Excellency, I think it's wonderful and almost like what happened in South Africa in terms of reconciliation. I think it's absolutely wonderful that you are representing Uganda here as the High Commissioner. That's really commendable.
Thank President Museveni for his leadership.
Exactly. So really, but before I go on to the question, thank you to all the staff and curators at Arundel's. It's a really beautifully put together exhibition, and wow, really moving.
Thank you.
But the question is, so 50 years later, it's really admirable that they moved on. What is the position of current people of South Asian extraction who've gone back, or directly? How are they viewed by a generation who probably didn't know about those differences, as Yasmin pointed out?
Basically, what it is that the Ugandan Asians, the people who really want to go to Uganda from Europe, London, and Sweden and Canada, where the Asians went, were taken as refugees, have been given the right to go back and claim their properties should they wish. And some have gone back, some have gone, claimed and sold and left, they're not interested. And some go with their roots trips, like now 50 years of, it's a commemoration actually, it's not like an anniversary, commemorating this. The third, fourth, fifth generation kids who've been brought up here, whose ancestry was from Uganda, are going back to have a look. But it's very interesting, in Uganda today, we have a whole new Indian migrant community from India that is going to Uganda to do business. And how are they viewed with the Ugandans? Great. The Ugandans are calling, like Sudhir Ruparelia is the mogul of industry today, a businessman. He's doing very well, worked from nothing. He was a taxi driver here, mini cab driver or something, and he's now a billionaire plus. And kids are calling him, their kids, Ugandan kids are being called Sudhir, another one's called Ruparelia, another one's called, whatever. So it's a whole new group of Indians that are coming and are working together with Ugandans, partnering, and one of the policies is that when we do a public-private partnership, 60% of the partnership has to be indigenous Ugandan. So you have to be Ugandan citizen. So there is this now awareness and very well accepted. Okay,
I'm going to disagree with you really strongly on this, because the 3 trips I've made recently, more than 4 or 5 times, even on my radio programs, young African Ugandans have said to me, the same thing is happening. And actually they didn't, 2 of them named Ruparelia. Now I don't know him and I don't know, and one of them said the difference between the Madhwanis and Ruparelia is this, they always gave back. So I think there's things happening on the ground and we should be more aware of it, and I don't want it to, one of my friends, Mahmoud Ali Bhai, who's gone back, is my school friend, his son married an African. And I thought, this is amazing. This could not have happened when I was living there. So yes, I agree with you that there's some fantastic things happening, but there is an undercurrent of resentment that we picked up when we were there.
There's 2 questions in this corner, please, and then you can have Jitesh just say a final word. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Amin Popper, and my grandmother came here, obviously in '72, and I just want to say thank you to David, because you've given me an opportunity to be educated here and give back to the community. My parents were part of that, Yasmin, you mentioned, they were going to open till 9-10 o'clock, and they work 7 days a week to give us the education and the opportunities that we have now. this is the first time I'm sitting down and hearing all of this from an education point of view. And I know you just talked about attracting young Conservatives. Why do you think that, we haven't heard these stories, and why has it not been in more mainstream education? Because I think that's what would attract it. And I feel really proud of Ted Heath, and this is the first time that I'm hearing so much detail about what he did for my family, and now I have a family of my own, and the opportunities that they have.
Giles, you're the educationist, it's your fault.
But I do, you're absolutely right. And I think partly it's because the generations before you've had to simply work so hard to get on, that there almost hasn't been the oxygen to think about the stories and the narratives, but that is now happening, I think, I think that what we actually need now is at universities and schools some scholarships to tell these stories, because otherwise there's a risk they'll disappear.
Sorry, we need to wind up in a minute, please.
Sorry, could I just add the racism that you mentioned you didn't face? I faced that, and I know my family faced that in abundance. Now that's only going to go, and people are only going to understand it through education of why that happened. So, yeah.
So one last question, and then Jitesh, please come up.
I'm Avinash Patel. I came here as an 18-year-old student from Uganda in 1972. I just want to thank Ted Heath and his government and young conservatives who made that decision. Growing here, I realized hard work that you guys did, and you allowed Ugandan Asian. We prospered here because of British economy allowed us to use our skills. We came from nothing, we came without anything. Yet, we are successful. We have contributed a lot to the British economy as well. We faced a lot of prejudices, but conservative government has valued our conservative values that we came with. And I thank, sitting here, my hero Ted Heath. As a young man, who was he? And I'm honored to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
As someone who was born in Uganda and came here in 1972, I have to say that even I have learned some things from this wonderful discussion. Praveen said that the story has many sides to it, and I think both he and the panel have done the most incredible job of unpacking those many facets. So I think on behalf of all of us, first, I think we should give them a huge round of applause. I think it's always the case that both in sort of physics and history, both distance and time lends perspective. And I think the black and white nature of history clearly doesn't exist. It has many shades of grey. And that's what we have had the pleasure of listening to this evening. I think as some have alluded, my family has enjoyed a close association, particularly with the Madhvani family. And in 1997, for the 25th anniversary of the arrival of the Ugandan Asians, we hosted a number of events. And one of those, and it's reflected in the exhibition, to which it's been a pleasure to contribute some materials, we held a Thanksgiving service at Westminster Abbey, where we invited many of the voluntary organisations, in fact over 70 that had worked together in helping in the 16 resettlement camps across the country. And we were very keen to invite Sir Edward Heath to give the principal address. And we struggled to sort of get hold of him and pin him down. And then one day, as I was sitting in my office, I had a call from the House of Commons saying that Sir Edward Heath would like to speak to you. And actually having for the first time visited Arundel's and having seen his study, I can now actually know probably the desk and the phone and the tremendous view of this beautiful garden from which he probably spoke to me. And he said in his sort of, and he has sort of quite a chuckly sort of, very, obviously you could almost feel his body move as you're speaking on the phone to him. And I was sort of, it must be the first time I've been called by a prime minister or a former prime minister, so I was sort of, my hand was shaking, and he said, I'm actually in the US when you have this Thanksgiving service, and my heart sank. But I'm landing that morning, and I will be there.
Hooray.
And he gave the principal address. We had, I think, something like, I don't know what the capacity of Westminster Abbey is, but it was full. Something like 2,000 people, and it was many of you, or some of you may have been there, and it was a wonderful occasion. And again, as this year, for the 50th anniversary, I felt some unfinished business to do, and as chair of the British Asian Trust, which was founded by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, we're holding a national commemoration event at the Guildhall in collaboration with the British Ugandan Asians at 50, which is a wonderful oral history project, which is with the help of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, capturing many of these histories of both the volunteers and the residents of the camps while we can. And in collaboration with them and many other organizations, we're having a commemoration. And so if any of you wish to participate in that, please do, maybe through Edward or come up to me afterwards. We would be delighted to have you there, because I think, as you said, this story does need to be told, and told again and again. And thank you all very much for joining this evening.